Hello everyone, welcome to Testimony, where we help you become test automation engineers one slice at a time. And today we are going to talk about one of the fundamental metrics in test automation. And of course we have a couple of fundamental metrics. We have like test coverage, we have the pass rate, and we have videos on both of these things already on the channel. And I really recommend you go ahead and give them a watch afterwards. They are called You Are Not Your Pass Rate and Should You Automate Everything. At the same time, they are not the only metrics, of course. There are other metrics, and one of the also fundamental metrics that is very, very important in test automation certainly is the test execution time. Be it talking about a given test execution time or a whole suite test execution time. And today we are going to talk about it because it is a way deeper subject than it may seem at first glance. Because as is the case with other metrics, I feel that people tend to fall for the usual, the more, the better approach. So, of course, if one test is quicker than the other, then of course it is superior. If we have two tests and both of them result in a pass or result in a fail, and at the same time one of them takes X time and the other takes X plus something, then of course the one that is shorter is better. And it is better optimized and it is just superior to use within your framework. But is it really the case? And just by me asking these questions, you probably already have a hunch that there is something more boiling underneath this lid. And of course there is. So when we are talking about hypotheticals, then of course if we have two tests and one of them runs quicker, it is better. But this is just it. This is the world of hypotheticals and the world of ideal situations, which is of course not something you will encounter in the real life. In the real world, blindly worshipping test execution time may very well be detrimental to the overall quality of your framework. I often see people treating actually having your framework run a few seconds faster like an achievement. And of course, it is important, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but you shouldn't treat it as a means to an end. It's not an achievement in and of itself. People tend to think that if numbers go down, then it is a success, but it is not that easy. Of course, it is very commendable if you have, while retaining the essence of the test, managed to make it run quicker. But this is where the culprit is. Have you really retained the essence of the test? So one such example, which we're going to use for the sake of this demonstration, is going to be trying to bypass all the time-consuming elements of a usual end-to-end test. So for example, instead of having your framework click through the navigation and all the dynamic elements, you just have it go to the specific URL right from the get-go. Instead of trying to log in to use the actual login form that the user is going to use, you just use API calls, for example, or provided some ready-baked session so that it is already authenticated when the tests start. Or when you are testing some integration with third-party APIs or third-party modules which need login, you just bypass all of that. You have it all mocked to the best case scenario, and you can jump freely across that bridge knowing that everything will work well. And while there is utility in many of those approaches, and we're going to discuss them at length in a separate video, because I'm going to make a video on how to make the tests run faster and how to do it in a sensible way to provide you some more insight into that, but let's not get too deep into that right now. So while there is some utility in basically all of the approaches that I've just mentioned, it is important to understand the context in which you are working. So if your goal is to create something that mimics real life customer journey, then are you really doing a great service and aid to your framework if you bypass all the elements that the user will go through, but you just kind of try to skip them and tiptoe around? Are you really doing it a favor if you are bypassing all the elements which do mimic the user journey? when your job is to mimic user's journey just for the sake of shaving some time off the execution time. And similarly, in our example, if you are testing integration of different elements, modules, and services, if you have some third-party modules, APIs, or have you built within your flow that the user also has to go through, are you really doing a favor to your project if you are trying to bypass all of this? Are you really still mimicking the user's journey if you decide that maybe you won't just go through all of it and you will just mock it and have it run in this like perfect scenario? You just have it all in this laboratory setting. Are you really still mimicking user's journey then? By doing this, aren't you actually introducing some flakiness into your system? Aren't you like adding uncertainty to the table? You are deciding to bypass elements which may very well break the whole flow. So actually, almost always when you're trying to test the whole integration, it's better to go like step by step as the user would, rather than just mocking everything to the perfect scenario and hoping for the best. Because in most situations, like sooner or later, real life will show you that best case scenarios are not the only ones you are going to stumble upon. And I bet you see the pattern now. I'm not trying to tell you that optimization is bad. Of course, it's good to think about optimization, about shortcuts and possible ways of saving time. At the same time, it's good to know why you are doing that, because over-reliance on such shortcuts can actually introduce things that you wouldn't want in your testing framework. And it may obfuscate the view, and it may actually cause your flows not to mimic real-life customer journey as much as you would like to, and thus introduce some problems within the whole flow. And of course, as with everything, it's important to strike a balance between the two ends of the spectrum. You don't want to mindlessly use shortcuts which you don't fully understand without like enough regard for the context of your framework and your application. But at the same time, you don't want to perform the full testing right from the homepage for every test case, because this is just validating things that have already been validated. This is just introducing redundancy, which is just as bad or arguably worse, depending on the situation, as introducing flakiness by bypassing some steps. So both ends of the spectrums, both of these extremes are actually going to be detrimental to the performance and the reliability of your test, and reliability should be your number one priority. So having said that, how about just putting the overhead into some sweet setup, for example, so that it does run, you know that the journey, the flow is correctly tested, but it only runs once, not once for every test. It runs once at the beginning of the suite. So for example, you do navigate from the homepage up to the page which you are testing, but only in the suite setup. So you do it only once. And you do log in, but you log in the setup so that the app is prepared for testing, and you know that this flow works from the front end too, not only through API calls. But at the same time, even though you know it works, you don't need to introduce redundancy. You don't need to revalidate it every freaking time. And I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to dig too deeply into such time savers right now. Like I said, there will be a separate video on them. I just want to reiterate by saying what I just said, that I am not vouching against time savers and against shortcuts in your tests. I'm vouching against mindless ones, which you implement without too much thought beforehand and during and after too. Similarly, I've seen people take the so-called good practices to the extremes. And for example, they have heard somewhere that explicit waits are bad and they are no-go. By the way, if you are interested in the topic of explicit waits, I will recommend you go and give a watch to some of the videos on this channel, because there's actually a 3-part mini-series that is dedicated to the explicit waits and to kind of demystifying the legend. But yeah, back to the topic. Some people take the good practices to the extremes and they decide that, yeah, so I've heard that explicit waits are bad. They are a sign of a bad test automation engineer. And so I am going to remove all of them. I am going to just go through the code, Control-Shift-F, and just purge all of them. It's the end. It's the end for explicit waits. And then suddenly they introduce some flakiness or tests start breaking because maybe the explicit waits were there for a reason. So yeah, badly placed explicit waits, they are bad and they shouldn't be there, just as any other command. Explicit wait is not any exception to that rule. It is not any specific example. It's just as with any other structure you are using within your code. If it's not there for a reason and you don't know why it's there and it's doing a disservice to the actual testing process, of course it shouldn't be there. But it's not because it's explicit wait. It's because it's an instruction that is placed without too much afterthought. And so when you have explicit waits in some spaces, in some places in your code, maybe they are there for a reason. So for example, maybe there's some third-party integration that does need some time to load and you don't really have a good way to use something more tangible to wait for some element. And then it's just the easiest to go with that, and it's important to have it covered as soon as possible. Or maybe there is some sluggishness on the side of the backend, and you have an environment that is also working slowly, and you need to wait because you don't have any element from the front end to actually wait for. So you need to just give it a wait of a couple of seconds because you know that the backend guys introduced something that causes it to run slower. There's a lot of situations in which, mainly those where you don't have control over what you're actually waiting for, that you can use explicit waits in, and that they have the place. And so in such situations, removing that, just blindly going off and just cutting everything off, that's not really a good idea. And yeah, you may save a couple of seconds and it feels good because in the case of thread sleep or explicit wait, it seems like you know exactly how much time you've saved. You just remove one line and bam, you immediately know that you have just saved like 5 seconds. Yeah, but maybe at the same time, you would have just introduced a bunch of false negatives in an otherwise perfectly functional set of tests. The mere idea of explicit wait being there doesn't mean that it's a wrong design decision. Don't just jump to conclusions because something has a time assigned to it. And similarly, people tend to go to the extremes with timeouts, for example. I sometimes see people, not only the beginners, blindly shortening timeouts just because they seem too long to them. Like, how do you define seeming too long? Like, do you just look at and try to eyeball it? Or do you use a stopwatch? Sometimes it's defined by the application specification, for example, and you can't really do anything about it. Like, you can, but you can't in a sensible manner. Maybe they are of a certain length for a reason. And I see sometimes, I hear people saying that, yeah, they're just going to cut the timeouts in half because if the test is going to return a fail state, then at least let it have it return it faster. Yeah, but you are not taking into account what is actually happening there. What is it waiting for? Maybe it would return a fail state either way, but maybe the waiting time is there for a reason. Maybe, once again, it is known that this part of the application is slow. Maybe it is known that this environment is slow. Maybe it is known that something is happening that needs to be waited for or that needs to be accounted for. And just by removing, by shaving some time on top of each of the timeouts, maybe, once again, you are introducing a bunch of false negatives to an otherwise fully functional set of tests. If something is taking long, you can raise it with your team. You can raise it with someone in the organization, depending on the hierarchy. But just blindly deciding on your own that, yeah, I think like 5 seconds timeout is too long of a time, let's just give it 1. I don't think this is what you are aiming for. So I hope you are starting to see what I'm getting at. While test execution time is a really important metric, it is just one of the fundamental ones. And only when we do consider them in unison can we actually draw some sensible and educated conclusions rather than just validating our pre-made opinions about them. It is always good to be on the lookout for optimizations, but it is not good trying to cut corners just to get to them. So trying to just shorten time execution without taking proper care of understanding the architecture, understanding the application as a whole, without understanding the specification, without understanding how it all is wired up together, may make your tests look better on the report in the short term. But it is not something you should be aiming for, ever. Because in reality, this would just introduce a bunch of problems under the hood, like problems with introducing flakiness or gaps in coverage because suddenly you are not testing something because you wanted to jump through that hoop. And the worst thing about that is you very often don't even recognize it until it's too late. So it's not like when you introduce these so-called shortcuts that we have just talked about, and you have shaved off some time, you immediately see that something's wrong. If this was the case, this wouldn't have been a problem because people would immediately know that, yeah, okay, I shaved over a few seconds, but it is performing worse. The bad thing is you may not observe it until way later down the line. It may take days, weeks, or months until you actually see the long-term consequences of your optimizations. So it's better to think about that beforehand rather than end up in a situation when a couple of months down the line you see that, yeah, you have actually over this time frame you have actually saved a couple of minutes of the running time of your whole regression suite, which takes 3 bloody hours, but you have saved 3 minutes of it. But at the same time you've introduced so much problems that now it's back to the drawing board and you need to work on those test cases again because, yeah, they are running faster, but they are not as reliable, for example. And of course, there are tests which do rely on execution time more than the others, like tests that are built into the continuous integration pipeline or smoke tests, sanity testing. Of course, these do rely on execution time because they are run very frequently, and if they are too slow, they can actually hinder the developer experience and they can actually stall the progress of the application as a whole. And they could create bottlenecks in the whole pipeline. But having said that, the speed in this situation is not achieved through introducing some, parkour shortcuts throughout your code, but rather by understanding what they are testing and adjusting the scope accordingly. So once again, even in the case of these tests, the speed and the performance is a function of understanding what is happening and adjusting your test accordingly, not a result of neglect and trying to just kind of maneuver around it in order to hope for the best. So don't try to speedrun your testing. Your testing are there to provide reliability, to provide trust in the application, to provide confidence in high quality releases. So if you are sacrificing all of it, like if you are putting all of it on the altar of shaving off a couple of minutes of a couple of hours long run that is run nightly, then I think you should reevaluate your priorities. Just be mindful of the trade-offs you are introducing and making when introducing some time savers. So whenever you think of something that would save time within your framework, try to think of it from a different perspective. Try to think of it as, what is the trade-off that I am making? What am I sacrificing right now for it to run faster? And if the answer is nothing, then you should really reevaluate again, because this is very tricky. Very often, our first intuition is to say nothing. It's not introducing anything bad. Of course, I'm the greatest tester ever, so of course it's not introducing any problems. Whenever you think of it, there should be a big red light in front of you. Is it really not introducing any problems? Is it really not tied to any trade-off you are making within the framework? I'm 100% sure. And if you think this through, and if you really think that it is cool and it is not introducing any problems, then by any means, of course, go ahead and it's great. But if it is, then try to think if this sacrifice is worth making. So is, like, for example, limiting the scope of this suite worth it just to cut a couple of seconds, minutes, whatever, from the whole run? Is running fewer assertions worth it? Is actually risking that this may sometimes give false negative a good enough reason to change it in such a way? It's a game you have to play yourself. You can't really, I can't really give you a ready-baked solution for that. It depends on the organization, on the project, on the scope, on what is the subject of testing. But I am just urging you to ask these questions to you, because it's one thing to be mindful that there are some problems that are going to be, or that there can be some problems, and it's a completely different ballgame to understand what the problems are and to actually own them, to know that, yeah, we are sacrificing some scope for the sake of it running faster because XYZ. It's all cool then. The worst thing is when you don't understand why it's going to work or why it's not going to work, and you still go on with it. So once again, this is not a call to be lazy or mindless in your creation of test automation suites. This is a call to be mindful of the decisions you are making as far as the design of the framework is concerned. To understand those decisions, to own them, to actually understand the repercussions, and to act accordingly with an educated decision rather than a guess. It's a call to think about them in a broader context every time before you introduce them, rather than fixating on having a few numbers go up or down, because testing is not a numbers game. It's a game of providing confidence and reliability. And with that thought, I hope that I've managed to shed some light on why faster is not always better in the case of testing. I really recommend you go and watch a few other videos on our channel where I dive way deeper into some topics that I've just brushed up on within this video, to visit our social media. And as always, thank you very much for your attention and keep on rocking.